do this.
Are you there? Are you there?
Gregory? I got your message.
Scott Cawthon? I have things to say. Stay for a second. Scott Cawthon. Midnight Motorist? We need to talk. Uh-oh, God. No, Scott. Wait. I've spent the last 2 years of my life dedicated to figuring out the biggest mystery in all of Five Nights at Freddy's. Midnight Motorist. And in this video, I'm gonna share everything that I found. This is by far the most comprehensive FNAF breakdown I've ever made. Let's get started. Midnight Motorist is one of 3 lore-heavy minigames in FNAF 6, with the other 2 being Fruity Maze and Charlie's Death minigame. FNAF 6 is the most lore-heavy game in the franchise, and that's on purpose. In the interview Dawko did with Scott Cawthon, Scott stated that FNAF 6 was made explicitly to answer questions regarding the story.
That was a game that was born out of necessity because I needed to kind of bring a conclusion to several events from the series.
This means that the most vague and mysterious minigame in all of FNAF came from a game that was supposed to tie up loose ends. And as ironic as that is, it's also fascinating. It makes me wonder what Scott was thinking when he made this minigame. Did he intend for it to be this big mystery, or is he genuinely shocked that the community is still trying to figure it out? In a game that does answer a ton of questions regarding the story and gives a satisfying and epic conclusion to everything, Midnight Motorist is virtually the only thing in the game that feels unsolvable, and it's because of how random it is. The minigame takes place directly after Charlie's death. Afton pulls up to the pizzeria, kills Charlie, and speeds off. Midnight Motorist is showing us where he sped off to. We know this because the minigame is labeled later that night in the game files. The minigame shows Afton driving back home, but before he gets there, he passes a clearing in the woods containing a mound of dirt and a bar called Junior's that he was apparently kicked out of. You can even see the bouncer standing at the entrance who promptly tells Afton, "Come on, you know you can't be here, don't make this more difficult than it has to be." This is the part of the minigame that makes the most sense. Scott was giving us important context to Charlie's death by showing that Afton was under the influence when he killed her, possibly explaining why her death was so sloppy and spontaneous. Afton then eventually finds his way home, walks in the door, and is met with someone watching TV. The person says to Afton, "Leave him alone tonight, he had a rough day." Afton then goes to the bedroom only to find that it's locked. Quote, "I told you not to close your door. This is my house, he can't ignore me like that. I'll find a way in from the outside." He then goes outside to find that he escaped through the window, along with some animatronic footprints next to the bushes. Afton then says, "Ran off to that place again. He will be sorry when he gets back." Then the minigame ends. Even with the full context of the minigame, there's a whopping 5 big questions left unanswered. Who is the person watching TV? Who is the runaway? What was buried in the middle of the woods? Where did the runaway run off to? And why are there animatronic footprints by the bushes? In order to answer these questions, we're gonna do something a little bit different. Let's look at this minigame from the perspective of the developer, starting with the person watching TV. When Scott made this part of the minigame, he likely started with this, a blank room with nothing in it. He then knew he wanted to add a specific character to the room, likely a member of the Afton family. Scott then decided to add 3 details to help us better understand who this is. He had the person sit and watch TV, wear a gray shirt, and talk with gray text. These are all traits that belong to Michael Afton. In FNAF 4, Michael wears a gray shirt, uses gray text, and in Sister Location is known for going home, sitting on a chair, and watching TV. The only 3 details we get about this character perfectly line up with Michael. But if this is Michael Afton, who is the boy who escaped out his bedroom window? Well, by process of elimination, it has to be the only boy left in the Afton family, the crying child. Need more proof? In FNAF 4, we learned that Michael Afton is in charge of babysitting the crying child, and in that game, we constantly see them home alone together, just like we see in Midnight Motorist. Also, one of the main things we learn about the crying child comes from one of the very first lines we get in FNAF 4. Quote, "What did he do this time? He locked you in your room again." Whenever Michael wasn't terrorizing his younger brother, he would constantly lock him in his room. And what do we see in Midnight Motorist? Michael and the crying child home alone with Michael watching TV while the crying child is locked in his room, matching perfectly with everything we learned from FNAF 4. So far, we've answered 2 questions with some pretty solid evidence to back them up, but we still have 3 questions left, with the next one being a big one. What is the pile of dirt in the clearing? This random pile of dirt has driven me nuts for over 7 years now, and in my opinion, it is the biggest mystery in all of FNAF. Here's why. Unlike other parts of Midnight Motorist, there's literally nothing to connect this pile of dirt back to. The person sitting in the living room had specific traits that connected directly back to Michael Afton. The runaway has specific traits that connect it right to the crying child. This pile of dirt has nothing. Every time the pile of dirt is mentioned in official FNAF media, it's referred to as a secret grave. And I think the community has collectively agreed that that's what it is. Someone or something was buried here. And since we have basically nothing to go off of, let's once again look at this from the perspective of the developer. When Scott was making Midnight Motorist, he knew he wanted to add this grave, but instead of putting it in a cemetery or a hill by a tree like we see at the end of the game, he put it in the middle of the woods, clearly intending it to be hidden. The fact that the grave is so hidden in quote secret implies that whatever was buried here is part of some sort of crime, or at least something that someone wants to cover up. So in order to figure out whose grave this is, let's go through the list of crimes in this franchise. First, we have Charlie. Maybe after her death, Afton decided to cover it all up by burying her body in the middle of the woods. But we know that's not the case because we literally see Afton drive away after the murder, leaving her body outside in the rain. So we know it's not Charlie. Another popular theory in the community is that this is where the crying child was buried. But like we established earlier, the crying child is likely the runaway, so he would still be alive at this point. So the crying child is also off the table. I've heard some people say that this could be the grave of Mrs. Afton, but that feels a little too random. Not only is there no mention of Mrs. Afton dying in this franchise, there's only one vague mention of her existence at all. In the TV show Immortal and the Restless from Sister Location, we do seem to get a parallel to Mr. and Mrs. Afton in Vlad and Clara, but that's literally it. Mrs. Afton isn't very satisfying and doesn't have much to back it up, so she's out of the running. Next up, we have Elizabeth. I actually really like the idea of it being Elizabeth's grave, because her death was a freak accident entirely caused by William. Not only that, we know that Afton actively tried covering it up. When Elizabeth died and Circus Babies closed, Afton hid the truth from the public by saying that the restaurant closed down due to gas leaks. So it would totally make sense that Afton would want to hide her body. But in order for this to work, Elizabeth would had to have died before Charlie and the crying child. And I just don't see Afton creating animatronics specifically built to capture kids that early in the timeline. So although I do like it and it could make sense if we get more information, I don't think this grave belongs to Elizabeth. So if you haven't noticed yet, we are quickly running out of dead people. And at this point, I was about to give up. Every answer I could come up with felt unsatisfying because there was no evidence to back it up. So before I gave up, I decided to try one last thing. Actually play the game. But this time, I would really analyze it from the developer's point of view, like we've been doing this whole video. And it was during this one playthrough that I discovered the theory that I'm gonna share with you today. In FNAF 6, there are 3 lore-heavy minigames: Fruity Maze, Midnight Motorist, and Charlie's Death minigame. The first thing I noticed was in order to get the lore keeper ending of the game, you need to complete all 3 of these minigames. This is interesting because there are other things you can buy in FNAF 6 that feature lore, such as Candy Cadet and Egg Baby, but those ones aren't required to get the lore keeper ending. Scott purposely paired these 3 minigames together. Why? Well, we know that the security puppet minigame and Midnight Motorist are directly connected. Midnight Motorist literally takes place directly after Charlie's Death minigame. The minigames are so connected, in fact, that I started asking myself the question, why does Fruity Maze even exist? That may sound odd, but really think about it. The security puppet minigame revealed that Charlie possesses the puppet and gave us more info on how that happened. Midnight Motorist revealed important context behind Charlie's death, showcasing that Afton was was under the influence when it happened. It also showed us exactly where he sped off to. Candy Cadet told us the story of 5 things becoming one thing, explaining how all of the spirits ended up in Molten Freddy. Egg Baby gave us Henry's insanity ending speech, which is arguably the biggest lore drop in the entire franchise. All of this stuff is super important to understanding the lore of these games and the franchise as a whole. And then there's Fruity Maze. Fruity Maze tells us the story of how Susie, the kid who goes on to possess Chica, was lured into the back room by Afton. And that's it. This minigame feels odd because it's not required to understand anything. We already knew that Afton lured the kids into the back room, and Scott even reveals Susie's name at the end of the game. The only purpose of the minigame is to show the specifics of how Afton lured Susie into the back room. So that again begs the question, what is the purpose of this minigame? Well, like I said earlier, Scott purposely paired this minigame with Midnight Motorist and Charlie's death. And just like how Midnight Motorist gives added context to Charlie's death minigame, I think Fruity Maze gives added context to Midnight Motorist. I actually think all 3 of the minigames are connected to each other. In Fruity Maze, we learn exactly how Afton lured Susie into the back room. It's revealed that Susie's dog had died, and Afton told her, quote, "He's not really dead. He's over here. Follow me." What if I told you that it's not a human buried in the woods in Midnight Motorist, it's Susie's dog? Let me explain. The more you play the Fruity Maze minigame, the more it starts to break. First, you see a bunch of fruit scattered throughout the maze. Then you start to see Susie's dog alongside the fruit. And in the final phase of the minigame, the fruit is gone and we see 3 things: Susie's dog, a mini coffin, and flowers. The music in the minigame then cuts out and you start hearing a car alarm. After the car alarm, you then see Afton show up behind her. The car alarm indicates that Susie's dog was hit by a car, and the coffin and flowers indicate that the dog was buried somewhere. The fact that Afton knows that her dog died match with the eerie car alarm playing before Afton shows up tells me that Afton had something to do with her dog's death. The absolute nail in the coffin for this comes from the final detail we see in this minigame. Randomly scattered throughout the final phase of the minigame among the dead dog, coffin, and flowers is a yellow rabbit digging a hole in the dirt. Scott added a sprite of a yellow rabbit, aka William Afton, that dug a hole in the ground. And in Midnight Motorist, we see something down the road from Afton's house buried in the dirt in a clearing right next to the road. Why did Scott show us the story of how Afton lured this one specific kid? Well, it's because it gives us important context for Midnight Motorist, therefore connecting all 3 of these minigames as part of the Lore Keeper ending. In all of the FNAF games, this is the only time we've seen anything relating to Afton burying something in the dirt, and it comes from a minigame that was intentionally paired with Midnight Motorist. So now the question becomes, why? Why create this storyline about Susie's dog and then immediately show us where it was buried in the very next minigame? Well, the answer is he did it to establish a timeline. By showing us what happens directly after Charlie gets killed, we're able to see which characters are still alive. In Midnight Motorist, we see that Michael and the Crying Child are still alive directly after Charlie was killed, which means that the Crying Child must die after Charlie. The inclusion of the dirt mound, though, throws a whole new wrench into the timeline. If this mound of dirt was put there to imply that Susie's dog was already dead and buried before Charlie died, that would mean that the missing children's incident likely happened before Charlie and the Crying Child's deaths, effectively making it the first major event in the timeline. This goes against pretty much every interpretation of the timeline I've ever seen. But for fun, I decided to keep going and see if there's actually evidence to back it up. Could the missing children's incident really be the first event in the timeline? Well, the first thing I thought of was the FNAF 4 minigames. In those minigames, we see the Crying Child walk up to a little girl who says, quote, "You'd better watch out, I hear they come to life at night, and if you die, they hide your body and never tell anyone." This is odd because the commonly believed year of the missing children's incident is 1985, and we know that this minigame takes place in 1983. That means that the rumors of kids being stuffed into animatronics existed in 1983, before the Crying Child was even dead yet, which would line up with the missing children's incident being the first event in the timeline. While replaying FNAF 6, I also noticed a weird detail about the Charlie death minigame. One thing about Scott's 8-bit minigames is that they have little to no details, so much so that we don't even know which pizzeria this minigame takes place in. Scott really only adds details that are required to understand the basics of what's going on. So when we get to the part of the minigame where we go outside, you can see that Scott added rain and garbage cans to show that we're on the side of the building. But one other thing he decided to add were posters taped to the walls. This is a common thing you'd see on the side of a building, but what's interesting is the type of poster it is. Scattered on the walls outside of the pizzeria are wanted posters. In a minigame that has little to no detail, Scott took the time to make a wanted poster featuring the outline of a man wearing a hat. Not only that, he scattered the same poster all over the walls. A popular trope in movies and TV shows is to hang a comical amount of wanted posters of the same person all over the place. It's a way to emphasize how important it is for this person to be caught. And it seems that Scott did the same thing here. By putting a bunch of wanted posters outside of a Freddy's restaurant, it's almost like Scott was trying to show us that a criminal having something to do with Freddy's was on the loose when Charlie was killed. And I think that criminal could be William Afton. If Midnight Motorist really is showing us that the MCI happened first, these wanted posters would be a great way to show us through environmental storytelling that William Afton already was a wanted criminal before Charlie got killed. And one of the strongest pieces of evidence for this actually comes from one voice line in Ultimate Custom Night.
I was the first. I have seen everything.
Chica says, "I was the first. I have seen everything." This voice line blows my mind because in a series where Scott has stated that he likes to clear up misconceptions from past games in future games, he decided to add a voice line in the very last FNAF game he ever made that says, "I was the first. I have seen everything." This heavily implies that Susie was the first murder in the franchise, which would make sense if the MCI happened first. Another piece of evidence comes from Help Wanted 2, where we see 6 graves for Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, Golden Freddy, and the puppet. But there's a specific order that we need to light them in. That order has Chica first, Foxy, Bonnie, Freddy, Golden Freddy, and then the puppet. This matches perfectly with everything we've discussed so far. Chica was the first, she's seen everything, followed by the rest of the MCI, and then Charlie. All of this stuff shows that there is evidence to back up this timeline of events, which means that this very well could be where Susie's dog was buried. So that's 3 of the 5 questions with a pretty satisfying answer to back it up. But now we get to the actual hardest questions to answer in this minigame. Where did the crying child run off to, and why are there animatronic footprints by the bushes? Unlike the pile of dirt in the clearing, we actually have dialogue we can analyze that's related to the scene. When William Afton comes home to see that his son escaped out his bedroom window, he says, quote, "Ran off to that place again. He will be sorry when he gets back." The most important part of this dialogue is the word again. Ran off to that place again implies that this is a pattern of behavior. Afton also immediately knows where he ran off to. This isn't the first time the crying child has done this. That then begs the question, where is he running off to? One possible option comes from the Twisted Ones, which released 6 months before FNAF 6. In the book, Charlie gets kidnapped by one of the Twisted animatronics, and her friends are desperately trying to find her. While her friends are looking for her, Shadow Freddy appears in the woods, and her friend says, quote, "I don't know what it is, but I think it wants us to follow." Shadow Freddy then lures them directly to Charlie. What Shadow Freddy is and why it did this is never explained in the book, but what if it helps explain Midnight Motorist? What if, just like in the book, Shadow Freddy appeared outside of the crying child's window and lured him to Charlie? In FNAF 4, we're told repeatedly that the reason the crying child is scared of the pizzeria is because he saw something. So what if the thing that he saw was Charlie getting killed outside of the pizzeria? This theory is pretty popular in the community and is similar to ID's Fantasy's take on Midnight Motorist. Every time we see the crying child in FNAF 4, he is terrified of Fredbears. But Midnight Motorist showed us that that wasn't always the case. It turns out that the crying child used to run off to that place all the time. He loved going there until he saw Charlie get killed outside of the pizzeria. I really like this explanation, and it's because it gives a solid reason for why Scott set Midnight Motorist on the same night as Charlie's death. The reason he showed us that the crying child ran off to the pizzeria the same night Charlie was killed was to connect those two events. Midnight Motorist showed us that the crying child wasn't always scared of the pizzeria, while also showing us the night that all changed. Also, Shadow Freddy luring the crying child to Charlie not only matches up with the Twisted Ones, but also FNAF 3, where we see Shadow Freddy luring the animatronics in the Follow Me minigames. This is a great explanation and is super satisfying, but I do have a few problems with it. In FNAF 4, when the crying child is left alone at Fredbear's, he's told to run towards the exit. But if you try to go further into the pizzeria, you hear, quote, "No, don't you remember what you saw? The exit is the other way. Hurry and leave." This implies that what the crying child saw was further inside of the pizzeria. The crying child wouldn't want to go outside if what he saw was Charlie being killed outside. Also, 2 months after FNAF 4 came out, Scott gave us 3 clues to help figure out the game, with one of them being what is seen in shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child. This is Scott outright telling us that the crying child didn't actually see anything bad happen, he misunderstood what he saw. There's a reason that after we get the line, "Don't you remember what you saw?" we see this Easter egg, an employee in the shadows of the back room putting on a Bonnie suit. The crying child saw this and thought someone was being stuffed into a suit. This is why he wants to leave the pizzeria and is scared of the animatronics. When confronted with one, he's told, quote, "It's too late. Hurry the other way and find someone who will help. You know what will happen if he catches you." That "he" is clearly referring to the Fredbear mascot that just appeared in front of him. So although I love the theory of crying child being lured by Shadow Freddy and witnessing Charlie's death, it's not perfect. Speaking of things not being perfect, this whole theory isn't perfect. Susie's dog being buried in the clearing and the MCI being the first event in the franchise has evidence to back it up. But time and time again, in the Silver Eyes trilogy, Fazbear Frights, and the Into the Pit game, Scott has established that the MCI happened in 1985, making it impossible for it to be the first event in the timeline. You could argue that those books and the Into the Pit game take place in a different continuity, but with how many times Scott has stuck with that year, I doubt he would change it for the main games. And with that, the entire theory falls apart. But that's kind of the point of this video. I wanted to show you the process of what it's like to theorize about this minigame. From getting excited about finally finding some solid answers with solid evidence to back them up, to finding the 1 or 2 things that make it all fall apart. The theory I shared with you today does contain my best guesses for what this minigame was trying to show us. But at the same time, I don't believe all of it. I love the idea of Susie's dog being buried in the clearing. I even decided to look this up to see if anyone's thought of this before, and it turns out a couple people have. But in order for this to work, the MCI can't happen in 1985, and I believe it does. I also don't think the graves in Help Wanted 2 are showing us a death order. I think they're probably showing us the order the spirits moved on. In the Happiest Day minigame, you can see the MCI victims' masks drop first, with Charlie's then dropping last, matching with the grave order. The thing is, it feels like Scott's been trying to give us answers for this minigame for years now. There's multiple stories in Fazbear Frights about a kid being lured out of their house by an animatronic and taken to Freddy's. We also recently got the Midnight Motorist level in 5 Laps at Freddy's, which confirmed Afton is the Orange Man. And finally, we have the FNAF movie, where Scott literally showed us a version of Midnight Motorist playing out in real time. During the night, Golden Freddy shows up to Abby's house, where we see someone sitting in a chair watching TV and Abby in her room. Golden Freddy then sneaks Abby out of her house and takes her to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And the funny thing is that this could also work in the games. Just like Abby, the crying child is also being taken care of by his older brother Mike. The crying child also has a close relationship with his plushies, just like Abby. Abby calls the animatronics her friends in the movie. The crying child calls his Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy plushies his friends in the games. The crying child could easily be friends with the animatronics. And Midnight Motorist could be Golden Freddy sneaking the crying child out of his house at night to go hang out at the pizzeria, just like in the movie. But like we established earlier, this would only make sense if the MCI happened first, which seems unlikely. Midnight Motorist is one of the biggest mysteries in all of FNAF because of its extreme lack of detail and lack of things to connect it back to. And this could very well be on purpose. In the recent interview Daco did with Scott, he talked about how he makes his games.
You know, whenever I'm making these games, there are a lot of things that are in my head that are just flowing ideas. And when I have them and put them there, it's the first half of something. It's like a It's like a string or a rope just like reaching out, and I know that what's there on the other end is there. I trust that it's there. I know that it's there. And then whenever I progress forward, the rest of that just reappears. The rest of it appears and just fits into place perfectly. That's how all of my games have been made. I feel that there is something there, and I make the roads to get there for that to be revealed.
Scott loves foreshadowing and laying the groundwork for something to be explained later. So Midnight Motorist could be Scott giving us the first half of something with the rest being revealed later on. Who knows? This minigame is a great representation of FNAF as a whole. There are so many ways you can make everything work, but you can't achieve that without filling in some big gaps in the story yourself. At least for now. Subscribe if you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.